2023, the atrocities that were committed are unimaginable. The stories are horrific. If you remember that day, I still have on my shelf baby Kiefer Bribus, who was killed and beheaded. There were so many kids and so many women, and the stories sometimes are forgotten, but not by the relatives. My next guest is one of those relatives. She is Liz Hirsh Naftali. She is the great aunt of Abigail. Abigail was a 3-year-old little girl who was held hostage in Gaza for 51 days. She is also the author of a new book, Saving Abigail, the true story of abduction and rescue, a 3-year-old hostage. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm sorry about the technical issues.
Hi, Shaun. Thank you. It's all good.
Well, I wanted to have you on because this is something that sometimes time has a way of eliminating the tragedies and the stories and the abuse of certain people. And when I saw this story about your niece, what was the outcome? What happened?
Well, she was taken hostage after witnessing watching her parents both be murdered, and in her father's arms when he was murdered by the terrorists on October 7th. But Abigail was part of the group of women and children who were released after 51 days when there was a ceasefire, and women and children in that year ago, even more than a year ago, were released. So Abigail was released as part of that after being a hostage for 51 days.
So it's particularly upsetting the way that history has a way of being rewritten. And you see today all of the protests and all of the chanting for those people who did this kind of atrocity. I don't know. I can barely handle it, and my niece wasn't taken. This has to be insane for you to watch before your eyes, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, look, the people decided to come up with a new story within hours while Hamas terrorists were actually filming their atrocities on GoPro cameras. So the fact that people in America or across the world were changing the story and saying that it didn't really happen or that a 3-year-old was a perpetrator of this is just ludicrous, and it is maddening. But that's why I wrote the book. You know, Shaun, I decided that after Abigail was released, I continue to be an advocate for the 100 people and 7 Americans who, after 440 days, are still hostages. But writing this book was to tell the truth, because I do believe the majority of Americans, the majority of people, want to know the truth. And in Abigail's story, it is the true story of what this child endured and the atrocities that happened to her family, to our family on that day.
Now, prior to this, you know, you sound like a wonderful lady. Prior to this, were you very political? Were you very opinionated about different policies? I understand you probably had a different perspective of it, but prior to this, were you aware of how many Americans, how many people who had been involved in everything from college campuses to all aspects of life would somehow support the very people that did this kind of thing? Because I am political. It's all I do. And even I was shocked. I can't imagine what it's like for you.
Well, look, you know, before this, and I'm very clear, and I write about in the book, I was a Democrat. And I woke up on October 7th, and I realized I'm an American, and I'm going to fight for freedom. I'm going to fight for truth. And one of the things that myself and the other hostage families have been doing for, 15 months is speaking to Democrats and Republicans. We have made this situation this horror, this terror attack on October 7th, and getting back 246 people. We've made this bipartisan, and that has been really important. And so, like, when you keep talking about, and you're correct, the what's gone on the campuses, the anti-Semitism, the anti-Zionism, like, that's not acceptable. But for me and for the work that I'm doing right now is like focusing on how do we get back the rest of our people. And they represent still 7 Americans who are hostages, people from over 20 nations, 5 religions. It's a humanitarian crisis. And I'll say one other thing is that these people in droves, in hundreds, have come to our country, to America, to look for the support, and they have found it in our government and in both the Democrat and the Republican parties. And that, to me, is what I try to keep as the message, because that is a hopeful message and that is a true message.
Hirsh, you know what's amazing is that I was listening to you say, you know, you were a Democrat, and I have to tell you, even somebody, and this is all I do is I dig into the. I have always had a hard time saying that I'm a Republican because I'm really not. And as I listen to you talk, you're really not either party anyway. And we've been kind of lured into this into the system that makes us pretend that we support things that are bad for our country or bad for our people or bad for money. And, I think this is kind of the silver lining of the insanity that we've been watching. At this particular point in American history, I think more people are in the so-called I don't have a camp position than ever before. And when you have something like this, I'm curious to know, what is the defense by politicians who say to you and say to people like you, look, we're just going to let this play out, because it is insane how long this has been going on and the amount of people that are still captive. Why aren't we going there and getting them back at all costs? It's amazing to me.
Well, you bring in a lot of important points, but let's just remember that on October 7th, we woke up with all this 1,200 people killed, my niece and her husband, and 246 people, children, 35 children under the age of 18, infants that were kidnapped. And what I have learned from this is that, there's so much that went on before, and there's so much that's going on. But you have to remember, Hamas is a terrorist organization. They have built tunnels, hundreds of miles of tunnels. And what we've seen, which is the greatest tragedy, is that when Israeli IDF forces have even come close, the Hamas terrorists have been ordered to kill people they're holding. And so it's a very tough, very complicated situation. But at this point, and again, I am not a politician, I'm not a diplomat, but I've been doing this now very intensely for 15 months. And for me, the goal is got to be to release these people. And at this point, I don't know if we send in more troops, and again, I don't know, would they just kill all of our hostages? And for me, the goal is to bring home as many people alive as we can. So when you ask that question, I just say to you, and I say to people who are listening, that I'm not naive. I know that there's so much complication, and there is a Hamas terrorist organization. And I know that Israel has to do everything it can to protect itself, its sovereign state. I love Israel. But I also say we as Jewish people, we as humans, must focus on how do we at this moment get back these hostages and as many alive as we can.
Well, I also think it's time to stop pretending that a terrorist organization can be a government. This is a case, in a certain extent, of hoisted by your own petard, because we have, especially Americans, we have the luxury of being able to be ignorant because we're not on the front lines. But when you realize that these terrorist organizations, these cults, these zealots, they mask themselves as a government. And the people who are in there, the people like me, let's say, Hirsh, and I say this to you because I'm not religious. So there is no such thing as somebody like me in the so-called Palestine. You can't afford to not be a part of the cult. You can't eat. You can't live. You can't get food if you're not a part of the cult. Or am I missing something? Am I naive? Is there the standout, altruistic, non-religious person in Palestine that owns a corner store?
I don't know the answer, but what I do know, and I mean this, is Abigail is 3 years old. She just turned 5 as a free child. Her 4th birthday was as a hostage. And I can't imagine that there's a 3-year-old who is a terrorist on the other side. But what I can tell you, and you brought it up in the beginning, which is we shouldn't be defined as a Democrat or Republican if we really are about America. And at the end of the day, what I've learned in writing this book and in being in this experience is that I have found people that I thought were very different. And at the end, we have common humanity and common heart. And I don't know the answers to all of what you've just brought up, but what I just keep pushing is that we really have more in common with each other, and we have to figure out how to have really difficult conversations, how to really move things forward. And the bottom line, and I can only answer this, is that a terrorist organization should not run a country. You're absolutely correct. Yes. But here I am talking to you and saying, we've got to get these people home. And we also have to do this because for our family, the moment that we could begin healing, even with the terror and the loss of 2 people, the parents of Abigail and her siblings, is to move forward with getting Abigail home. And for these 100 people and for the state of Israel and for humanity, getting these 100 people home is the way to start to heal and move forward.
Let me ask you about your niece and her husband. How old were they?
Yeah. Late 30s, early 40s, very young.
And was Abigail their only child?
No, so Abigail was 3, and she had a sister who's 6, Amalia, and a brother, Michael, 9. And the three of them saw their mother be murdered by terrorists that came in the home. And a few minutes later, the terrorists killed the father as they were running for safety. And Michael and Amalia at 6 and 9, and I write about this in the book Saving Abigail so people know really the atrocity that took place, is they went home, they ran home, and they locked themselves in a closet before they could be rescued for 14 hours alone on a phone. That's how we knew what happened. But what ended up happening was that Abigail was in her father's arms when he was killed, but she actually survived. She ran in this community. She ran alone with terrorists everywhere, found somebody that could take her in, and then that family was taken as hostage, and she was taken with them.
You know what's amazing is I did research, obviously, when this happened. And when you read about it's called a kibbutz, right? Most American people have no idea what a kibbutz is. And a kibbutz is kind of a commune, for lack of a better word, right? And as I researched that particular kibbutz, that kibbutz had been very generous with their support of the people. They helped feed them. Do I have it right?
Yeah, I mean, first, a community. It's not I wouldn't say a commune. I'd say a kibbutz is a community. For Americans, it's like a neighborhood. It's where just people are together and they do things together. The kids grow up together. It's a really beautiful, this community of this area, this region in Israel where Kfar Aza is just beautiful. But the truth is, yes, these were peace-loving people that respected their neighbors. And in many cases, the people from Gaza were working on the kibbutzes. And in other cases, these people along the community were taking people from Gaza and bringing them to doctor's appointments. The people that were attacked, the 1,200 people, the majority of them were just peaceful people living life and really trying to cooperate with their neighbors. So this was this attack even had greater, just the thought of people who were attacked that were actually loving them and caring for them. And that's, to me, one of those stories that doesn't get told. But that is true about the people on Kfar Aza and along the border in their communities.
You know, it's just infuriating because if anybody gave the olive branch or made the exception to get along, it's the people in that kibbutz that were feeding other people. We're working with them. We're helping them. And as you look, I think what gets lost is there was a festival going on. I think it's the utter shock on the faces of the people in the rare videos we did see. I don't think they could mentally understand, why would you be attacking us? And when you look at it, this isn't something that I believe was spontaneous. This looks very, very orchestrated. And I'm wondering, are you involved with all of what you're hearing now about the so-called solutions, when I don't understand what the future will look like if we pretend this didn't happen and this kind of abuse doesn't need to be dealt with? Because it just seems like we've set ourselves up over and over and over, because this kind of thing happens on a sadly regular basis, doesn't it?
It does, and I go back to the first part of your question. Was there was this Nova Music Festival where young people were dancing, and it was a dance. It was a party of peace and freedom, and they were at 6:30 in the morning, like all of the people in Israel. And I was in Israel that morning, shocked and surprised, and sirens were blaring. But along the border, and where this Nova Music Festival was taking place, right at the border, these people were just out having a beautiful time, young people. And that just another piece, which was like 1,200 people were at this festival, and over 350 were killed, and many were kidnapped. And again, I say that because it is telling the truth about what happened on October 7th. And look, the only thing that I can say, Shaun, and again, I'm not an expert, but I don't want Abigail or her siblings to be on a call in 30 or 40 years with your children, your counterpart, having this same conversation. So we do need to have a lot of reckoning, and it is not acceptable. I just don't have the answers, but I'm going to fight for those, and I'm going to fight for what we can do to move it forward so that we don't put our children and other children in the same position that they're in right now.
The beautiful thing about being young and having a tragedy happen is that sometimes you don't remember it the way you would if you were older. Does she have any memory of what happened?
Yes. I mean, like she's a very smart, very beautiful, she's a kid that knows what's going on. And even though she was the youngest in the family, I would say she kind of is the child that, there's always a child that kind of runs the family. She's that child. She's really smart and dynamic. And she knows she was in Gaza. And I will say this, and I write about in the book, the blessing, if we're going to find one, is that she was with this woman, Hagar, who she knew from her community. Hagar's little son was in her class. And this woman took care of her. She loved her. They were in a little room with walls and windows all blacked out with nothing, no food, no water, just a piece of pita bread, no hygiene. But this woman, Hagar, is a hero. She loved this child, hugged her. They couldn't talk out loud. They were silenced, but she still gave her the warmth. And even amidst everything, and you're right, children are resilient, but they remember. But she will always have had that warmth of this woman. And again, it goes back to just that common humanity and how we can be helping each other and be there for each other, even in the most horrendous moments.
Well, I have to tell you something. I don't believe in things. Everything I believe happens for a reason, right? Sometimes the good, sometimes the bad. But when a child like this lives through something like that, and has that kind of experience, I just hope you and I live long enough to see what she becomes, because I'm betting she becomes something amazing and somebody that changes the world. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate you.
Oh my God, you have me crying. You have me crying because she could do that. I hope she will. And I hope that we will be able to connect and look at it and think, wow, this is what this child took from this atrocity. And she made it into something that was inspiring.
Well, Liz, my screen went down, and I mistakenly had called you Hirsh, but I will not make the mistake again, Liz. And I hope one day I get to meet you, and I hope I get to meet Ab again. Thank you so much.
And can I just say thank you, Shaun? Like, we're in the season of holiday and spirit, and we have Hanukkah and Christmas coming together. And I just hope that people will tell the truth, but we will be able to be together and find joy and hope, and maybe there'll be a miracle and they'll release them, because this is the time for miracles.
I couldn't agree more with you. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I look forward to eventually, hopefully, meeting you in person. Thank you, Liz.
But be well. Thank you, Shaun.